And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 9 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. And tonight, we're going to be covering the Berlin-Rome axis and how this relationship and this alliance actually forms, which is very interesting, fascinating, a ton of nuance, and a ton of political circumstances and decisions made by the Allies that in many ways drives Mussolini really into Hitler's camp. And, listen, as I said earlier in this series, Mussolini was never the biggest fan of Hitler. He is famously known for saying that he was an idiot, basically, and how he wanted to bulldoze, if you ever got the opportunity, Berlin. Got to remember, the Italians and the Germans never had a great history. They were on the opposite ends of World War I, and because the Italians had turned sides in their alliance in that war, the Germans looked down on the Italians as sort of as traitors. And this is something that will play in the mind of Mussolini later on after he got in this alliance with Hitler that he wanted out of, but he couldn't get out of it. And for that part, Italians never really liked Germans. And we see this as really the war machine of the German is gearing up. So many Italians were skeptical about joining the German side, but circumstances in the geopolitical world, unfortunately, left Italy isolated at that point. And while this decision by Mussolini was disastrous for him and disastrous for Italy, it's really a difficult one to cover because it's heartbreaking in many ways. Because there were so many times where this alliance could have been avoided if there was some sensible reasoning on both sides, from the Allies and from the Axis powers, as Mussolini always kept the door open to get into the Allied side, but a lack of response, confusion, and fear from the Allied side really muddied the water in many respects as these alliances are forming. And so this is where we're going to try and tackle tonight, how Mussolini went from one of the most respected leaders in Europe, even by American standards, to joining on the side of the Axis powers, and a lot of the things and events and political decisions that were made primarily in the 1930s that got him there and ultimately his doom. I think when we look at this relationship, we have to start at a few different places. First of all, we have to talk about the Versailles Treaty, something that Mussolini after the war really warned Europe about, saying, listen, you guys got this treaty, you got your boots on the back of the Germans' neck, and these people, they're going to lash out. If we don't update this treaty, there's going to be another war in Europe. And Mussolini is saying this in the early 20s. He knows the treaty is too harsh, but the French are dead set on punishing the Germans for all the lives that were lost in World War I, obviously giving the blame of the war to the Germans there. And so you got that there. And in this process, because everybody's fearful of a Second World War, you have a situation where there is a series of treaties and pacts that are signed to try and hold the entire continent accountable. And Mussolini is there at the forefront of these, because for Mussolini's part, he talked about peace a lot, specifically for Italy. He wanted to avoid war as much as he could because Italy had its own problems. It had an infrastructure problem. It had deep financial problems. It could not compete economically with the likes of the British Empire, the French, the Americans, and a few other nations. Italy had had problems with natural resources or lack of natural resources, and it had a population problem. It couldn't grow enough food anymore to sustain a booming population growth, and the Italians had their issues. And so this led to many of the factors that would actually lead to the war itself and some of the decisions that they made. And that's why we get into the issues of colonization, Ethiopia, and things of that nature later on, as Italy's trying to expand out to acquire natural resources and more land for a growing population. We covered some of that in the previous parts of this series. But I think when we look at all these events, we look at the Locarno Treaty, the Four Powers Pact, and eventually the Stresa Conference. These were all designed to try and keep peace and check in Europe, primarily on Germany. And when it came to the Four Powers Pact, that was one that was proposed by Mussolini, to where if one of the Four Powers Pact went to war or there was an aggressor against that particular country, the other three nations would come to the aid of that nation being attacked. And so this would play later on as things develop on the ground. You have appeasement movements going on in France and Britain. Those two nations, they were just exhausted after World War I. They lost a lot of lives, and it's very understandable why they would want to avoid a war at all costs. But the appeasement went so far that it empowered Germany to rise again without any deterrence. And so this is the backdrop that we have. And let's get to some of the events that drives Mussolini away from the Allies and into the arms of Hitler. I think when we look at this history, we have to start with Austria, which is a very important political event, a very important geopolitical moment in history, where Hitler gets into power, I believe it's 32, 33. And of course, everybody knows that Austria is going to be first on the chopping block. It has large parts of it that are German speaking, and the Germans feel that it's their land. Post World War I, it was taken away from them, and everybody knows they want Austria back. And so with Austria sitting on the border of Italy, this really hits home with the Italians. It was 1934, and there was a scheduled visit by the leader of Austria, Duce. He was good friends with Mussolini. He was a devout Catholic, and Mussolini has sworn to protect Austria. Now, on the day before Adolphus was supposed to come to Rome for a conference to meet with Mussolini, his wife came a day in advance. Adolphus stayed back for an extra day to settle some issues in his country. And within that 24-hour time span, there was a Nazi renegade group that assassinated him. Adolphus, the leader of Austria, was dead. Mussolini, at the time of his death, was visiting a mental hospital, I believe, in Rome, and his advisors came up to him and informed him that his friend Adolphus had just been assassinated. They say the look on Mussolini's face, he was stunned, absolutely stunned, and couldn't believe it. And he rushed off from the mental hospital, went over to wherever his wife was staying. I don't know if it was a hotel or a hostel of some kind, and went to go inform the wife of Adolphus that her husband had been shot. Now, the political ramifications of this, Mussolini knew exactly what it was. You assassinate Adolphus and you make a move on Austria. Mussolini's immediate response was to send 4 divisions of his military to the Brenner Pass to head off any attempt for Germany to make a move. And once he does that, the Germans are discouraged. Because, see, the Germans are arming up, but they're not quite ready to go into full-scale war. They won't be ready for another 3 to 4 years. But they thought Austria was weak enough that they could take Austria. But the moment Italy sends those 4 divisions to Brenner Pass, it forces Hitler to withdraw, draw back, and disavow the assassination, saying that he had nothing to do with it. But they were some type of Nazi renegades that assassinated him. So temporarily, Mussolini had stopped the beginning of World War II, but he had a problem. And the problem was that Italy in and of itself wasn't ready to fight a war. And according to the Four Powers Pact, which included Germany, France, and England, in an aggressive move such as this, France and England were supposed to come to the aid of Italy because Germany was seen as the aggressor in this case. Even though Hitler disavowed himself, from Mussolini's perspective, he knows exactly what's going on. And he's calling out to the French and to the British saying, listen, we got this Four Powers Pact. I can't stop this guy by myself. I need you guys here to help me out. And of course, with the British and the French going through appeasement movements, they don't react. They send out some formal condemnations publicly. They keep waving papers and speaking words, but the French and the British don't come. That's the bottom line in a nutshell. This was the moment that Mussolini realized that he might be all by himself here, that these treaties and these pacts may have been empty words, empty agreements in many ways. And now this puts Mussolini in a position where if Germany ever makes a move, he realizes he may be by himself. And that's a problem. And he realizes that. You're going to see a lot of these political maneuvers, despite his hatred of Hitler, that it's a relationship that forms out of necessity in many ways because of the terrible decisions that come from the Allied powers, primarily those decisions coming from Britain. So, step one, Austria. Nobody comes to aid Italy. Number two, Spain. The Spanish Civil War. King Alfonso XIII abdicates the throne in 1931. A far-left socialist communist government is elected. Franco has his troops out in Morocco, devout Catholic. You begin, the atrocities begin in Spain, collectivization, persecution of the church, desecrating the bodies of nuns, murdering the clergy, banning the institution of marriage, and all the horrors that communism brings to any society. With this, Franco takes charge, lands on the mainland, of course, and begins a civil war to take back the country from the communists. It is here that Mussolini decides to intervene on the side of the nationalists and Franco. The fear that Mussolini has is the flag of the sickle and hammer waving in Western Europe. He enters purely for ideological reasons and to protect Western Europe from the influence of communism. Remember, Mussolini was an ex-Marxist. He fought the communists in Italy. He pushed them out. Many of them came from the Soviet Union. He got rid of them. He fought. He beat them. Now he's fighting again in Spain. So, what happens in Spain? Well, the first of which is the French. The French, which always had a tattered relationship with the Italians. The Italians, again, being not only fascist and kind of coming back more to the center politically, again, it is a liberal ideology, don't get me wrong, but it's one that recognizes the problems of socialism and Marxism and begins to moderate back to the right, so to speak, in this political, European political atmosphere. The French government is made up of radicals, socialists, and Freemasons. Italy being a Catholic nation, well, these are two ideologies that are diametrically opposed to one another. Mussolini did too go after the Freemasons in Italy. And so there was always tension between the French and the Italians. And being so far to the left with France after, again, the French Revolution run into that country and all the moral depravity now for almost 150 years at that point, well, you know what? It was natural that the French would ally themselves with the Soviets, and they were working out an alliance together for quite a while. Hence, the French going to Spain on the side of the Soviets. The British, however, were in a conundrum. The British didn't know what side to take initially. Initially, they tried to stay neutral. The problem is that, again, the Soviets had begun a massive propaganda campaign to the Western liberal republics, making the case that the true great evil and the only true totalitarian force on the face of the planet was fascism. And with the supposed free press under the dictates of democracy, you had a democratic population with democratic sensibilities that had been turned against the Italians, right? You even had protests. You had the population of Britain that was so anti, again, fascist or dictatorship at that point that they were chanting, quote, "No agreement with dictatorship, send armies to Spain." And so there's even now this notion to get, at least from the public, the British to join on the side of the Soviets. But the British kind of know that the Soviets are a problem themselves. And the question is, what side do the British kind of stand on now? Is it the communists or is it the fascists? Which is a fascinating debacle that they're in. Eventually, however, because democratic sensibilities, they rule in a democracy, every elected official in Britain was forced to bow to the dictates of the electorate. And it was a nation that was very anti-Mussolini, anti-Italian, and eventually it kind of intervenes in a way where it's trying to get Mussolini to get his troops out of Spain, and they begin to put pressure on Mussolini. Of course, Mussolini's response is, okay, well, listen, I will pull out if you get Stalin to pull out. And of course, nobody was demanding necessarily that Stalin pull out. Mussolini stayed in. And all of a sudden now, with these democratic sensibilities in the background, Italy and Britain become ever more distant from one another. And really, because Hitler was also helping Franco, a natural, codification of that relationship really, I want to say it kind of began after World War I. And again, this is another point. After the World War I, and the Versailles Treaty being so putative, Mussolini is the only one on the world stage telling the world, listen, this treaty is so punitive, it's going to lead to another war. You're being way too harsh on the Germans here. They're going to lash out at some point. It's going to lead to another war. Even though historically Germans and Italians never really liked each other, that simple public confirmation by Mussolini, it kind of began this strange cordial relationship between the two nations. Again, Germans didn't like Italians, Italians didn't like Germany, but the Germans began to appreciate the honesty of Mussolini and him willing to go out on the world stage and say, wait a minute, this is not good. And it kind of began there, that cordial relationship, really in the early 1920s. But here we are now at the Spanish Civil War, and you got another thing where the Germans, the Italians are working together, and the French and the British are now working with the communists. And this is going to be a problem later on. And so this continues this gap that would widen between the Allied powers and, again, the Italians. All the while, Mussolini knows he's in no man's land because he still doesn't like Hitler on a personal level. And so that's really the third chip that falls. The fourth chip that falls is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, all right? We've been through this before. There was a battle in Ethiopia for resources. Italians needed land and resources, and the British had their foot in the door as well, too. They had their own ambitions there in Ethiopia. Make a long story short, it's a state of in a state of anarchy. It's a state that is tribalistic. You have Ethiopian rebels attacking Somaliland as well as Ethiopia, which are Italian colonies. The Italians are frustrated with this, that nobody can seem to get this anarchistic state under control. Anthony Eden makes a proposal to Mussolini, hey, let's split Ethiopia. The problem was the geographical territory that Anthony Eden was offering Mussolini was basically more sand in the desert. Mussolini said, BS, no. Because everybody was fighting for resources, right? As Vallari says here, right? Luigi Vallari in his book, Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini, what the Italians did in Ethiopia was no different than what the French were doing in Africa, what the British were doing in Africa, what the Americans did in Cuba and the Philippines, what the Dutch did in Southeast Asia, and what every other really nation empire did to expand colonially. In the case of Ethiopia, it was, again, a state in a state of anarchy. It had slavery. It wouldn't abolish slavery. Mussolini publicly promised to end slavery. The British were against ending slavery because they had their own backdoor deals going on with the Ethiopian king called the Negus there. Mussolini got tired of it, went in there with the approval of the church, and they took it over in a war. So this was really the breaking point of the relationship between the Italians and the Ethiopians. The fact that Mussolini slapped away the offer that Anthony Eden made was the ultimate insult to the British, but personally, even more so to Anthony Eden himself, who would never forgive Mussolini for this ever again, and Eden becoming staunchly anti-Italian after that point. So now this relationship continues to kind of drift apart, right? And all the while, Hitler is charming Mussolini the entire time, wanting an alliance, wants his southern sort of flank protected by Italy in that sense, right? And now you have the fourth chip that's fallen, right? The fifth chip that falls is that all these anti-fascist, anti-Italian sensibilities that were coming from England or France have made their way into America now all of a sudden. And while the Italians and the Americans had a great relationship, remember Mussolini called FDR a good fellow fascist, ironically enough. There's more context to that, don't get me wrong, but this is where they were. Mussolini always had a great respect for America, particularly for its ingenuity. But there was another factor here, and that is Italy was a nation that was short on resources. It didn't have a lot of coal, it didn't have a lot of steel, it didn't have a lot of oil. And it got a lot of steel and oil from America. But in 1937, with these, again, anti-fascist sentimentalities, particularly because Mussolini now not only in Ethiopia, but also in Spain, the Americans turn and they come to the aid of their English brethren, right? And they impose sanctions on Mussolini. Now you got a problem if you're the Italians. You don't have these resources. You don't have them on your land. It's one of the reasons why you have all this emigration out of Italy, because you could never truly build the infrastructure of Italy without those resources and the high-paying jobs that comes oftentimes with gathering these resources. So it leaves Italy in no man's land. And where does now Italy turn to? Germany. Germany, to get its oil and to get its steel and get its coal. And once again now, the Allies make a move to continue to drive Mussolini away, and again, codifying this relationship with Germany, really because he didn't have much of a choice. He was forced into this kind of relationship under these circumstances. Because now Germany, well, basically, you know, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. It's what's going on at that time. And so you have that as well, too. Fifth, the fifth point here, or the fifth shoe that drops here, the Mediterranean Ocean and waters. Because for centuries, the British Empire kind of had, had its ways out in the oceans because of a very powerful navy. Well, Mussolini starts building a powerful navy himself. The Italian Navy was very strong by the time you get to World War II. Where Italy's military failed was the Air Force was the big problem, but their Navy was very strong. And because the British had controlled the Mediterranean for the longest time, Mussolini said, wait a minute, hold on. We're going to have to, talk about this, because the Mediterranean is our region here. And while we can have some mutual respect here, we don't feel like we're ever getting this. Remember, the Anglo empires, America and Britain, because they had governed the world in many ways, were the superpowers of the world. Whenever they went to a negotiating table with other nations, they came in as the superiors, and they would dictate their terms and conditions because they were the most powerful of nations. But with Mussolini, his perspective was, listen, I don't care what empires you have. We have to deal with each other with the same amount of respect. And this is what was the problem in the Mediterranean. And Mussolini agreed to a deal where a gentleman's deal, no paperwork signed, but that both nations could kind of use the Mediterranean waters. Because see, the British had to get to their African and ultimately their Middle East empires through the Suez Canal. And you got to go right by Italy, right through the Mediterranean there. Mussolini wanted an understanding that ocean was open to everybody, including Italy, for that matter. He didn't want his navy being bullied again or have problems with the British Navy. They came to a gentleman's agreement, but a year later, the British began to renege on that because, again, he was a fascist dictator. And we're now living in a day where democracy is seen as the greatest of moral goods, the greatest of virtues, right? And this was the fifth really shoe to drop as this relationship between the British and the Italian falls apart. Now, and for Germany, Germany is playing the game here, right? It's playing both sides itself. It has its own interests. First of all, when the war starts, Mussolini is telling Hitler, listen, we have to protect the southern part of our front, which is Italy, and where the Mediterranean is. That's where the Allies are going to attack. Hitler, they say, according to the Nicholas Ferro book, Mussolini, A New Life, Hitler never respected or understood sort of the importance of the Mediterranean. Remember, he's up north in the Baltic region, right? They got access to water up there, don't get me wrong, but you know, this guy is a guy that's building a powerful, you know, sort of land military for the most part. And so with Mussolini, he understood the importance of it. And Mussolini's advice to Hitler, which he did not heed, would come back to haunt Hitler. Point number 6, the British decide to privately start negotiating deals with the Germans to give them more naval space and airspace. Again, going against the treaties that were signed by all the other nations. I think it was a violation of the Versailles Treaty. It was probably a violation of the Four Powers Pact, Locarno and Stresa. I think it was a violation of them all. I got to confirm that, but it was a violation of previous treaties that the British solely were negotiating their own, their own deals now with the Germans when everybody should have been brought in. And this infuriated Mussolini because it put him in an impossible situation. It undercut the treaties themselves. And once again, this is the British working on their own for their own interests, driving a wedge between themselves, Mussolini, and at some point, Mussolini figured, what choice do I have here? Now, let's lay out the political landscape here. You got the Soviets in the East, who Mussolini was fighting against in Italy during the time of the early 20s, late teens, early 20s. Mussolini pushes, and the fascists push out the communists back to the Soviet Union. Then you got the war in Spain. Then you got the war in Ethiopia, or sanctions against Italy. The British have become distant. The French and the Italians never had a great relationship. How does Italy maneuver in a world that is now being surpassed or conquered, if you want to use that word, by Western liberal democratic sensibilities in the West and communism in the East? Who are your allies? The British have rejected you. The French have rejected you. The Americans have rejected you. You're not going to make a deal with the Soviets. The only one left is Hitler. And whether we like it or not, this is the position or the choice he was put in at that time. There wasn't much left. Even though Mussolini constantly tried to get the approval of the British, constantly negotiating. At one point, the anti-sensibilities of Anthony Eden against Italian got so vicious that even a lot of the other parliamentarians within the British government began to see a problem here. And by 1938, it was Chamberlain and I believe Churchill that finally talked Eden to bring Mussolini on board. And Anthony Eden was so angry about that he resigned his position. The problem was we're in 1938. And they have pushed Mussolini so far. Mussolini had pushed off with this alliance with Hitler for so long that it became too late. It was in 1938 that Mussolini signed the Pact of Steel with Germany. Time had run out. As much as Mussolini tried to negotiate and talk with the British, always being pushed back. The main factors being Ethiopia, that was really the big one. The Spanish Civil War too, but really Ethiopia, because Mussolini always wanted a confirmation from the British. Finally, the British in 1938, again, want to give him confirmation. And again, at that point, it was too late. Mussolini had jumped on board the Hitler bandwagon at that point, to his devastation, right? But it seems to me there wasn't a whole lot of options for him. Now, could he have stayed out of that alliance? Yeah, he probably could have, though I do understand why he joined it. Again, who are your allies at this point? Because see, authoritarian or fascist sensibilities sweeping through the Western lands was a big part of this. The psychology of democracy, and democracy, again, not being able to fathom that the idea that another nation was not democratic, that it was authoritarian to some respect. It didn't matter that the Italians are all right with fascism in Italy at the time. That didn't matter to them. The fact is that the democratic nations and democratic peoples believe that their way of life, their political system was altruistic, right? This was a new form of government endowed by this indifferent God that somehow presented itself during the Enlightenment. This became the ultimate virtue. This became the ultimate good. This became of this indifferent, divinely established political system that the whole world now was gravitating toward. And authoritarian governments now were seen as sort of backward ass and inherently evil by these Enlightenment ideas. For Catholic nations, of course, they've always had problems with democracy, right? And so an authoritarian form of government based upon natural law with the church in place, the Catholic nations were fine with that. But of course, the Western republics, starting with Britain and America, the Anglo-Protestant nations, well, they didn't care for that too much. And so this is what drove Mussolini away. Now, it's interesting, something I looked into a little bit more, a little bit closely, that throughout the war, Mussolini claimed that he had documents that he was in continual talks with Churchill. I think they're called what, the Mussolini-Churchill Documents, where Mussolini was constantly negotiating with Churchill behind back channels. It's kind of a conspiracy of sorts in Italy, and the documents were never found, but Mussolini always talked about them and took it to his grave. One of the theories is that Mussolini, when he was caught by partisans, aka communists, and before he was assassinated, those documents were probably destroyed, but we really don't know. It's never been proven. But what we do know is that Mussolini was ready to leave Hitler when the opportunity presented itself. We know that because toward the end of the war, especially after 1943, once Mussolini is deposed by the king and he's put up as the puppet leader of Salo, Mussolini begins to really despise Hitler with all of his moves, especially after Hitler takes out his revenge against Italians for turning on the war and the atrocities in northern and central Italy starting after 1943. that really was a problem for Mussolini, who loved the Italian people and loved Italy. This relationship was one that was made by the politics of Western powers. And listen, in the Vallari book, it is clearly stated by English journalists that the relationship or the alliance between Germany and Italy was made in London and Paris. This is English journalists that have made this claim. Now, I quote the Vallari book because he is the insider for us in Italy historically. He's as close to a first-hand resource as we're going to get. He worked in the Mussolini administration. He was a diplomat in America. He was a diplomat in England. He's given us the Italian side of the story. So not to be biased, I'm also incorporating here the very same ideas that are pushed by Nicholas Farrell, Mussolini and New Life, as well as Richard Lamb, who wrote Mussolini and the British, as well as War in Italy, 1943 to 1945, A Brutal History. These three books collaborate pretty much on the fact that Anthony Eden was the bad guy here. For as much as Mussolini tried to codify this relationship with the British and get on the Allied side, Mussolini was constantly rejected because of the fascism issue. That the democratic sensibility, particularly because you had a supposed free liberal press in Britain that constantly went after Mussolini. And so the public had turned very anti-authoritarian, anti-Italian, anti-Mussolini. So even if the politicians in Britain saw the value of bringing Mussolini in, you still had to deal with the general public and, the problem of possibly losing your cabinet post or your political position in Britain because you just got ousted from power at the voting booth. See, this is the democratic problem. And ultimately, this is why Mussolini, in my opinion, ends up in Hitler's camp, is because democracy and the challenges that democracy brings when you have a population that's been manipulated into accepting a limited worldview. It's the problem we have today in our democracy, right? We have two parties, a left or a right. We only look in two terms, generally speaking, right? We're given narrow visions. And in a day and age of mass media, social media, 24-hour news cycle, right? Our little phones, our computers, I've always argued that as Americans, despite our claims that we're free, we're actually the most brainwashed people in the history of the world because of all this mass media and the way it's presented to us, right? Well, something very similar is happening in England and really throughout all of the West. It was going to be impossible to codify this relationship because of democratic sensibilities. The moment we go from truth, justice, and democracy, and we look at a nation like Italy that is chosen in some respects, approved of their form of government, Western sensibilities say, no, wait a minute, whoa, you got a problem here. We don't approve of it. We don't care if the Italians, they're enslaved, so they can't know what's good for them. We're democracies. We're free in this nation, and we're telling you that what you have there is unjust. You've been brainwashed. Hence, we're going to tell you what's best for you, right? We're going to spread freedom, whether you like it or not. And this has been the model of Western liberal republics now for at least the past century, if not longer. That sensibilities, that bias in Western sort of liberal geopolitics has been around from here to kingdom come. It really has. It's been around forever, and it played a role here. Despite the fact that Mussolini constantly saw the problems with Hitler, constantly didn't like Hitler, and constantly didn't want to be in a relationship or an alliance with him. And so this is what you have. So I laid out at least 6 events. I'm sure there's more there. And as I continue to study and research, I'll lay it out more and more. But again, when we look at how this relationship forms, think about Austria, Ethiopia, Spain, FDR's sanctions against Italy, and the breaking of all the pacts that were signed by the Allies, Locarno, Four Powers, and Stresa, and then, of course, eventually, democratic sensibilities and democratic liberal press that played their role in defining a biased idea of world politics. Where have we seen that, my fellow conservative friends, right? It's not like we've ever had a liberal bias that has given us a purposeful narrative. This was just an unfortunate time and so many mistakes made. Again, as Vallari argues, Nicholas Farrows argues, and Charles Lamb argues, this all falls square on the shoulders of the British, particularly Anthony Eden, for botching these negotiations in World War II. And they actually argue, in fact, Vallari argues that if the British could have gotten over themselves, especially over Ethiopia, you might have not have had a World War II. You bring Mussolini on, okay, now every flank that Hitler has is covered. Every flank. You got the British to the north, you got the French to the west, Soviets to the east, and the Italians to the south. It's a big gambit at that point by Hitler if you got the Italians on your side. So, I don't know. It's just one of the unfortunate things. It just reminds me, like Our Lady said, that war is the consequences of sin. And this thing was unavoidable because of our fallen nature. And but I still like to study the nuance of history, which oftentimes we're not taught at liberal universities here in America. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The Berlin-Rome axis, how it was formed, and how Mussolini and Hitler wound up fighting together in the same war, both which were a disaster for both men at the end of the day. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.